talk about technical interviews, or specifically about technical screening part of interviews. Mainly because recently I've been going through an interview process to find a new job, and there's been some frustrations, some weirdness, and basically that's the reason why I'm giving this talk. Otherwise I wouldn't have been at all kind of like riled up or like passionate about the subjects at all, to stand up in front of people and give the talk. And also it seems strange to me that a lot of people who interview programmers or who go interviewing don't do a lot of training and don't seem to know how to do it. I certainly haven't. I've been involved occasionally in interviewing programmers. So something that I think we should all talk about a bit more, especially if you're involved interviewing people, and also if you want to learn from other people's experiences being interviewed. I'm just going to talk about a few different methods of technical screening and the good and bad points about them, and then maybe we can talk about our different experiences afterwards. So the first sort of horror story or weird technical screening technique is the, if you can't work out the really clear diagram up there, is the coding over the phone technical screening. So this, what happens here is that they can ask you to log into Google Docs or some other collaborative coding tool, and then ask you to code some usually quite simple system while they watch, and I imagine they just laugh and just sort of look at each other and go, this is dreadful. And this is basically the sort of impetus behind this talk. Is a blog post of a talk by a developer called Pamela Fox, who wrote a blog post called Technical Interviews Make Me Cry, because she went through this process, and even though she's really famous as a JavaScript programmer and in general people know who she is, she reached this process and just mind went blank, and just sort of really struggled through this process, and I've been in there as well. So I had this exact experience a week or two ago, and that's why I said to John, I think I'm going to talk about this, because it's really weird. But what's wrong with this, apart from the fact that it's so daunting, it's so strange, I think it's just because it's such an unnatural environment to code in. I don't know how many of you in your actual jobs actually phone someone up and then code over the phone, but I've never done it. Never under this kind of pressure. Normally you have some time to do your coding, you can check references, maybe talk to other people. This is not the usual way to program. But if you keep it, I think the sort of the nuance here is that if you do a really simple problem like this browser or something along those lines, where the programming is so simplistic and so trivial that it sounds pointless in doing it, then it could be not too intimidating for candidates. So it's possible that you could do this, but I think in my opinion this is just an anti-pattern of interviews. At the very least, people should offer an alternative, just offer an out to people and say, look, if this isn't working, just show us some code. You don't have to do it in front of us. The variant of this, if anyone can recognise what was on that fake whiteboard, will be impressed. I just looked up on the internet. Kind of messed up the graphics. But anyway, the variant of that is the coding on the whiteboard challenge, which is, I've never actually seen this myself, but it's apparently well known in some big interviews like maybe Microsoft or Google have sometimes done this. And this is a very strange situation to be in, of being told to write an algorithm or any coding solution on a whiteboard. You've got no access to Google, which is essentially how I do my job. I'm fairly sure that's not unusual. My memory is not particularly expansive, so this would just be utterly terrifying, I think, to me. And again, the question arises like, what are people testing here? The ability to write code on a whiteboard is probably not that useful, except in more interviews. And I think if companies insist on doing this, the very least they can do is explain up front to people what the interview process will be. And in my experience, people don't normally inform people what the process will be until you're in it. So you might say, okay, the next thing I'm going to do is you're going to code on the whiteboard. It's not the right way to prepare people. That's pretty unfair. So yeah, I can't think of many positives about this particular technical screening, and it's time consuming for everyone, so it's probably not a particularly good win. This is the most common technical screening method I've seen, which is the take-home test. And it seems to work pretty well as far as I can see. Give someone some coding challenge or some system that's specified on like a side of A4 and say, spend no more than 3 hours working on this, hand in the results and then talk about in person afterwards or on the phone what the candidate has done. And this seems to be a bit more of a natural way to work. It's not too dissimilar to the way you actually do your job. You're given some sort of specification, you work on it in your own, not in your own time. You work in a self-directed way as a programmer normally, so it seems a little bit closer to reality. I think often people worry, or interviewers worry with this method, that it can be gamed, that you could just pay someone else to do it for you, which seems like a bit of a non sequitur, given that you should always be asking candidates afterwards about the code, just a sanity check whether they actually wrote it and whether they understand it, and challenge them. Maybe you found the bug and you can ask them about how they might fix it, things like that. In a sense, that's the same way you test someone who hands in a PhD thesis. You don't just trust that it's theirs, you give them a viva voce, ask them questions about it and just rule on it. But asking questions about code someone's actually submitted to you seems like a much fairer way to do a technical screening than to give them a blank screen and just challenge them to code in front of you. I think this can be improved a bit. Most of the time I've seen a coding challenge, and they vary a lot. Like some of them are little games you have to write, some of them are, like one I had was an ASCII image editor that was quite challenging. Some of them are just so dreadfully boring that it's hard to actually work out the motivation to do the test. And sometimes it might just be not applicable to your experience. So I think the real improvement you can make here is just do this in the exam style. Like choose one of these 3 different tests. I've not seen anyone do that, but I think although it might triple the effort you put into setting up tests for candidates, it's worthwhile doing unless you're hiring a really specific role and so you therefore need a test to be really specific. It's probably a good idea to give people some option into how they do the test. Possible downside is that this could be quite time consuming for candidates. Not everyone has the same amount of spare time if they have family or people they're supporting in their own time. Not everyone might have 3 hours that realistically they need to do in the next day or 2. So you need to make it flexible enough to say spend up to 3 hours. It's fine if you do 30 minutes and then hand something in. It's just so long as we can see some code you've done. And again, I don't think people tend to be that good at being forgiving about the amount of code that's handed in or the amount of time spent on it. There are a lot of assumptions made about the amount of spare time that people have that are unnecessary. So yeah, I think it's important with this test and with all others that you set expectations quite clearly and be flexible. So if this isn't an option for a candidate, if they can't do it for whatever reason, then you just need to give another option really. The next technical screening test, or rather interviewing technique, is pair programming. This may not be suitable for technical screening because you've maybe already decided that they're worth interviewing and spending serious interview time on. But this test is certainly worthwhile if your company does pair programming, and I've seen it work quite well. And in my last position in digital science, we did this because we wanted people to pair program. So we were trying to hire people who worked well in that way, even though we didn't really pair program, so it wasn't totally appropriate. But it does have certain advantages in the sense that you can find out how well programmers work with other programmers. Essentially, that's what you're doing. And you can work on something fairly real without worrying about it being too daunting, because there are two of you. The interviewer can hopefully fill in where the candidate doesn't know a particular library or the exact domain, and they can just always say, oh, don't worry about this, we're just trying to see how you solve problems. And the real advantage for the candidate is that you get to see the office that you might be working in. You get to see it in situ for about an hour. And although in normal interviews you would be in conference rooms or in interview rooms and sort of chaperoned around, people on their best behaviour, if you're paired programming in an office, you're going to see it real, most likely. People will let their guard down and just start behaving as normal when you've been sitting down for like 10 minutes or half an hour, and you'll see what the office is really like. So it's quite good from that point of view. My recent experience here was an okay paired programming interview where the other engineers just started fighting each other with Nerf guns, which was a clear sign to me that this wasn't a place that I wanted to work. So it was a bit useful to see what the company was. I wouldn't have known that really unless I sat in the office for an hour and seen what they really like. Their culture wouldn't have come through except in very subtle ways. But yeah, it works in that company because they literally all pair program. It's not a choice you make. Everybody has to pair program, so it just made sense that they do that. But it's not really going to be that appropriate for other companies that don't have a culture of pair programming or don't consider it to be a necessary part of the culture. And also not all candidates are going to enjoy that, and not all going to go in for that. They're not going to maybe thrive, and it might be just very natural for them as well. So yeah, it's nuanced again. And also you've probably already done your technical screening because you're spending considerable time invested in interviewing candidates here, so you already want to know whether or not they can program. And the last one I've actually drawn is not really a technical screening method, but auxiliary to that, maybe the next stage, is a sort of architectural whiteboard interview exercise thing. This was the stage after the take-home test in my digital science interview 3 years ago. And it works quite well because you get to see not whether someone can code or not is the really basic question you want to answer with a technical screening test. But then this is more about how they see the big picture, whether they can design systems, if that's appropriate for the role that they're hiring. So this is talking here about generic software engineer roles rather than a very specific role. And you can just challenge them in the interview and say, how would you design the system? And then they can just go wild on the whiteboard or whatever and just come up with there's no restrictions, they can just design whatever systems they like. And it's quite an interesting way to interview, and it can be, if you're not completely intimidated by the environment, it can be quite a good way to show your experience as a candidate and just throw in technologies you think are cool, essentially. And it works quite well. But yeah, this is the stage after you've done technical screening. It's not really ideal for testing whether someone is technically up for the role, because you could just throw out terminology and so forth. And as you can see, I've drawn super technical and accurate diagram all about the cloud. I don't know what I'm doing. And yeah, so you're testing here interaction between how a candidate interacts with other people in the team, essentially, and whether they can think about the big picture as well as right down to the level of the code, which is pretty essential for software engineers. Here's some other options that I've not personally seen used, but in discussions around this topic, these come up. Let's say the basic, the abstraction that you're trying to achieve with technical screening is you need to see some code the candidate has written. Most of the previous things I've just talked about are a way to see that. Either you watch them write it, which I don't think is that good of a way to do it, or you get them to submit some code. Technical tests are I'd say the traditional way to do it, but if the candidate literally has no time to do your technical test, or they just don't want to do it, then it should be acceptable just to send some code in. Maybe some code you wrote at work. Maybe it's confidential, you just need to send it in and say, this is confidential, but I wrote this class and a lot of work went into it, and this is the reason why I wrote it the way I did. That's a fairly good way to assess someone's coding ability, as long as you follow up the phone call and discuss the code. Next one is kind of unusual. It's a suggestion that someone made that you could take some existing code, some open source code, and review it with the candidate. So, say take an open source project that you know has bugs, well, all of them, but you know what the bugs are, and send it to the candidate, maybe up front, beforehand, so they can familiarise themselves with it a bit, and then maybe on a phone call you can talk through the code, talk about the way that the code is written, maybe there's some flaws in the design, and then you could work together to refactor it slightly to improve the code quality. And in that way, you've moved the focus away from the candidate starting from scratch and actually working from an even keel. You're looking at the same code base, neither of you wrote it, probably. And the ability to read code and review it is a pretty important skill for a programmer. But it is, my sort of impression of this is it's probably more appropriate to a senior level programmer, because if you're interviewing, say, graduates, they're probably not that used to reviewing code and having a really sort of insightful view into it and be able to immediately refactor it. That's not something they're probably prepared for. Third option is kind of unrealistic, but some people do this apparently, which is to employ people with a short contract period. This could work fine if the candidate is already a contractor, in which case they can have a week or a month to work for the company, and you use that contract period to see whether they would fit in. It's kind of risky for the candidate. They have to give up their existing job to actually do this. So that's why it'd be fine if they're already a contractor, but if they're not, it's probably not ideal. The advantage really is that all the work that the candidate does for the employer is paid, but it's a very short-term advantage. Like if it's a week of work, then that's all it is. It's a week of work. So that's unusual. And the fourth option for private pull request is essentially a simulated open source process. And this came out of a blog post where somebody said that they refused to do technical tests because they were a famous open source person, so you could just look on GitHub and it's pointless them doing technical tests. And the criticism of this is that not everyone can do open source work, many companies just don't allow it, and many people just don't have the time to sink into open source work or the inclination. And so this is the sort of the alternative. If somebody isn't publishing code publicly that you can use as evidence that they are a good programmer, is this sort of simulation of open source, where you create a project with some bugs, you give access to the repository to the candidate, you file a bug against the project, and then you wait for the candidate to open a pull request against the project. And then you have a to and fro conversation with the candidate where you do the sort of thing that you see in open source, where you talk about code standards and alternative ways of fixing the same bug. And you get to see how they communicate about code, whether they can take part in this conversation. And it's certainly similar to the way that I've worked in digital science, because we open pull requests, and my colleagues would look at the pull request and criticise the code and talk about whether or not it's going to work. So that's appropriate in those situations. That's a real world test. But there are many companies that don't use pull requests as peer review, so maybe that's not appropriate for them. Ultimately, I think some sort of mixture of these options needs to be used to realistically allow everyone to be able to get through technical screening without having it biased against them in some artificial way. And it needs to be flexible enough that anyone can get through that can code, and it doesn't matter whether they have spare time or not, whether they work for a company that just doesn't allow open source or not. And it needs to be such that the technical screening